Hi, I'm Jonathan Hafetz, and welcome to Law on Film, a podcast that explores the rich connections between law and film, looking at how law influences film and film influences law. This episode, we look at I'm Still Here, the 2024 film from Brazil, directed by Walter Salles. The film is based on the true story of the enforced disappearance and murder of former Congressman Rubens Paiva by the military dictatorship in Brazil. The film opens in Rio de Janeiro in 1970, where Rubens lives with his wife, Eunice, and their 5 children. Their lives are forever altered when the military government arrests Rubens and Eunice. The film describes Eunice's attempt to find out what happened to Rubens and to rebuild her life and raise her family in his absence. The film is based on the memoir of their son, Marcelo Rubens Paiva, who was a young boy when Rubens disappeared. I'm Still Here provides a harrowing account of the military dictatorship in Brazil and a moving story of a woman's struggle to overcome adversity and achieve justice. I'm joined for this episode by Isabela Amaral, a PhD candidate at the State University of Rio de Janeiro. She's also a temporary lecturer in constitutional law at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro and a legislative advisor to the State Legislative Assembly of Rio de Janeiro. Isabela, welcome to Law on Film. Great to have you on to talk about I'm Still Here.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Jonathan. And thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here to talk about I'm Still Here, a film that has gained such incredible attention after the Oscars. And it's also a special conversation for me personally because my PhD research focuses on artistic freedom and censorship. So I'm so glad we can have this conversation right now.
Let's go back to 1970, which is when the film takes place in Rio de Janeiro. So during the military dictatorship in Brazil, it's some years in by this point. And we have an opening shot just to let us know where we are, right? You have a beautiful scene in one of the beautiful beaches in Rio, and there's a military helicopter flying over. I think it's Leblon Beach from what I've read. But anyway, so you've got these kind of jarring contrasts. Can you give some historical context for this period? When did the military coup occur and why? And sort of what was happening in or around 1970 when the film takes place?
The military coup occurred in 1964 when the armed forces deposed President João Goulart under the pretext of preventing a communist threat. In the 70s, the regime was at the peak of repression. The Institutional Act number 5 that was a type of decree. It was issued by the military government in December 1968. It officially suspended civil rights, shut down Congress, censored the press, and even abolished habeas corpus in political cases. But repression wasn't limited to politicians like Rubens. A striking case was that of the musician Chico Buarque, who released the song Apesar de Você, a direct critic of the regime. The song initially played on the radio, but was quickly censored. And from then on, everything Chico tried to release was blocked. He even created pseudonym Julinho de Adelaide to sneak songs past the censors. This episode shows how the dictatorship tried to control not only politics, but also art and cultural life. And I think that's the context of the military coup and the regime in general when the film takes place.
Yeah, it's interesting that you talk about the sort of way it conflicted with artistic life and freedom of expression and artistic expression and sort of what the context was, right? Where it's 1970, sort of the 1960s counterculture, and that's sort of in full swing, at least in a big city like Rio de Janeiro. And so we see a lot of normal activities too. So that's one of the things I think is so great about this film. One of the first shots is we see kids playing volleyball at the beach. We see other activities like the family getting ice cream together. And we also see signs of the military government, the military vehicles around Rio Does it capture what life was like in 1970s with all these kind of really competing? You've got the military dictatorship, but you've also got the 1960s counterculture in full swing.
Yes, it captures it very well. Brazil lived in contradiction. On one hand, there seemed to be normal life, beaches, families eating ice cream, the 70s World Cup, a sense of prosperity tied to the economic miracle. On the other, it was also the peak of what Brazilian journalist Hélio Gaspari called the ditadura escancarada, the open dictatorship, a period of maximum repression, censorships, arbitrary arrests, tortures, disappearances. This coexistence of calm daily life and brutal political violence was one of the defining features of Brazil in the 70s. And the film captures another crucial element, the sense of fear that hung in the air. Even in ordinary moments, there was always the risk that the police or the military could show up, break the normality, and turn daily life upside down.
Which, I mean, is essentially, right, what happens with Rubens' family, right? I mean, it's exactly what happens. It's just interrupted. That's one of the central things in the film. And it starts out in terms of the larger events. What triggers the crackdown, one development that triggers the crackdown, at least in the film, is the kidnapping of the Swiss ambassador. Also, there had been a kidnapping of the U.S. ambassador to Brazil. There's just another film about that the year before. So how significant were these events and how did they kind of contribute to what was happening in Brazil at that time?
The kidnapping of Swiss ambassador in 70 was highly significant because it exposed Brazil's political tensions to the world. The year before, like you said, 69 U.S. ambassador Charles Elbrick had also been kidnapped. This actions were strategies of armed leftist groups to pressure the dictatorship into releasing political prisoners. It wasn't something that happened often, but when it did, it had huge national and international repercussions. The effect was, I think, twofold. On one side, it drew attention to the regime's abuses. On the other, it gave the government an excuse to intensify repression.
Yeah, and we see in the film the sort of intensification of this repression. We see it on one level where one of Ruben and Eunice's daughter, I think their oldest daughter, is out with friends and there's a military checkpoint and they're stopped, they're harassed. And then we also see the intensification that leads to Ruben's arrest, right, which becomes the central action in the film. And so the film shows Ruben's seizure and disappearance. I don't want to use, I mean, the word arrest is loaded because he's not actually really arrested in any formal legal sense. Instead, it's a group of men armed in plain clothes with no identification show up at Rubens's home. He lives in a very nice upper middle class area by the beach. They show up at his home and they tell him they need to take him in for questioning. No charges, no information is given to Rubens or to his family. And Rubens, we later learn, has been taken to a military barracks in the city, held without access to a lawyer or a judge, and tortured. So what were some of the circumstances behind Rubens' arrest? As this is based on a true story and based on what actually happened. So what were some of the circumstances and how typical was what happened to Rubens?
Well, Rubens was arrested because we represented exactly the kinds of figure the dictatorship wanted to neutralize. A former congressman, a lawyer for political prisoners, someone with legitimacy to give voice to dissent. His arrest illustrates what political scientists call authoritarian legality. The regime didn't see itself as outside the law. Instead, it created institutional acts, decrees imposed by the executive above the constitution that gave arbitrary actions and an appearance of legality. AI5, for example, allowed arrests without judicial order, the closing of Congress and the suspension of rights. So the government didn't need formal charges. It was enough to label someone a subversive, a communist collaborator like Rubens. And unfortunately, it was pretty typical. Arbitrary arrests, torture, and disappearances were systematic practices of the dictatorship. People were taken from their homes by armed men without judicial orders, and many never came back. Another very emblematic case was that of journalist Vladimir Herzog in 1975. He was summoned to testify at military barracks in São Paulo, and a few hours later was found dead. The regime released a staged photo to suggest he had committed suicide, but no one believed it. The case had an enormous impact. It led to a huge religious service in São Paulo's cathedral and became a turning point in exposing the dictatorship's practices. Herzog's case showed that repression didn't only target armed militants, but also journalists, artists, and professionals who dared to question the regime. Rubens' disappearance fits into this wider pattern.
Yeah, it's such an important point, I think, to underscore, as you did, the fact you have like with the journalist or with Rubens, a former congressman. So these are prominent people. I mean, to me, it suggests, how confident and assertive the military would be, the military dictatorship, and how brazen in its approach. And it also would have, I think, probably like a chilling effect, right, in ways that arrests of so-called ordinary citizens would not have quite the same effect. It's really multiplied when you see the military go after these very kind of prominent public figures. The other thing that I think your comment brings out is there's a line in the movie where Eunice, Rubens's wife, asks, how could this happen in a country with, quote, a supposedly functioning justice system? And I think that's one of the things that's so striking about the movie is probably for many people, the justice system probably was functioning the way it always had. But there was this other sort of system that you kind of described.
About the law system, the legitimacy of the regime, I think the Brazilian dictatorship leaned heavily on what scholars call authoritarian legality. Unlike Argentina or Chile, which relied more on extrajudicial violence or military decrees, Brazil systematically built a legal framework to give repression a formal cover. The clearest example is Institutional Act number 5 that I told you, but there is a lot of cases. Beyond that, the regime adapted existing structures like the Department of Censorship to institutionalize the control of music, theater, film. In other words, the regime didn't say it was outside the law. It created the law to justify repression. That's why even arbitrary arrests like Rubens appeared legal with a system manipulated by the military.
So after Rubens is arrested or taken to the barracks, Eunice, his wife, and their daughter, one of their daughters, Eliana, are also brought in for questioning by the military. They're handcuffed, blindfolded, as they're driven to the building the military is using for its detentions and interrogations, the barracks in the city. Eunice is not charged with a crime or given any access to a lawyer or legal process, but we see her interrogation, right? We don't really see Rubens. We just have to imagine it. Eunice is forced to look at a book with photos or headshots to say who she recognizes. The room is dark. They don't show any torture, but instead you hear it and you see it. There's blood on the floor. You see evidence of it. There's blood on the floor. presumably of someone who was tortured in the room before her. And she can hear people crying out in pain from the other rooms. Eunice is not given any information about what's happened to her husband beyond vague insinuations about associating and helping communists and terrorists in exile. Eunice is held in abysmal conditions for 12 days before she's finally released. Her daughter is released after a day. But even then, the nonstop surveillance of Eunice and her home and her family continues. So, what does this tell us about what happened to Eunice in particular? I mean, how common were these tactics to arrest or take in and interrogate family members in this way?
They were common because repression wasn't only about silencing militants. It was also about breaking their families. Wives, children, siblings were often taken in for questioning without charges to instill fear and psychological pressure. One powerful example is Clarice Herzog, the widow of the journalist Vladimir Herzog. She and her children lived under constant surveillance and intimidation after his death. Families were often wiretapped, harassed, or forced to testify. The effect was to turn everyday life into a state of fear, where everyone felt watched. In Eunice's case, being taken along with her daughter showed exactly this tactic, spreading terror beyond the main targets, extending repression into the family sphere.
And they don't really show it in the film so much, but presumably in other cases, right, what happens is not just in the family, but the neighbors, right, see where did this person go, right? They disappeared for 10 days, right? And that spreads the fear as well. It's just a multiplier effect.
Yeah, neighbors, friends, it's very common.
The other thing I thought was notable was what the military's response, right? They spread false information, they would call it disinformation, that Rubens was freed or had been freed by armed insurgents and fled the country. At the same time, the military government refuses to acknowledge they had anything to do with his disappearance. So how were disinformation and secrecy used as a sort of another tool in the box of this authoritarian regime?
Yeah, I think the dictatorship was a master at using lies as a political strategy. When someone was arrested, the government often simply denied it, saying the person had fled, was hiding, or had left the country. In Rubens' case, they spread the story that he had been rescued by guerrillas and taken abroad. Another emblematic example is, again, Vladimir Herzog. The regime staged a photo to claim he had committed suicide in jail, a lie that backfired and helped stir up the opposition.
And I'm thinking back, the tactics that you sort of described are these are 1970 tactics. I mean, the tactics now the regimes have now are so much more sophisticated and penetrating in terms of manipulation.
There is another case. Reports and historical studies also indicate that news about 70s meningitis outbreak were censored to avoid damaging the regime's image of progress. In short, I think secrecy and disinformation weren't accidental. They were central tools of authoritarian control to keeping families trapped in uncertainty and cutting off the possibility of justice.
And the response of some families, including even within Rubin and Eunice's family, was to leave, right? So before Rubens has disappeared, but as it's in the military dictatorship and their tensions are growing, one of their daughters, Baroka, their older daughters, moves to London with family friends, right? So how common was it for Brazilians, or at least for upper middle class Brazilians who had the ability to do so, to leave the country?
It was fairly common, especially among artists, intellectuals, and students. Many left because they were threatened, and others were freed from prison in exchange for kidnapped ambassadors, and some chose exile to continue their activism safely. Well-known examples include Caetano Veloso and Gilberto Gil, were jailed and then forced into exile in London. The educator Paulo Freire spent nearly 2 decades abroad. Exile was not just an individual escape, it also drained Brazil culturally and politically. For the regime, it was useful to remove inconvenient voices while keeping watch over their families and networks at home. In this way, exile became another tool of repression, making clear that there was no space for dissent in Brazil.
So it sounds like the military would, to some extent, allow or even potentially encourage some people to leave as opposed to, say, shutting the borders down.
Yeah, I think the regime encourage people to go out because it's better for a regime. There is a little bit lower dissent, and the regime, it's good for regime. Everybody that don't agree the regime go back and exile, and that's it.
And it's interesting too that you can see in the film. I mean, again, Veroka, their daughter, flees before Rubens has disappeared, but there's this sort of debate, right, that people are having. I'm sure it occurred in many homes in Brazil at the time, right, whether or not to go, how long to wait, and ultimately, they do agree and to allow her to go. But that dynamic is sort of captured because I think probably for people, especially people who are perhaps maybe a little less active or prominent than Rubens about whether or not it was, or maybe those people too, whether it was time to go, right? Or do you need to leave or could you still stay?
It's a difficult question. I don't know. I have a good answer for that. But the people didn't know when it's better to exile or stay here. It's a difficult decision because there is a lot of families, everybody, friends, and home, and just the middle class and upper classes have money to vacations or to exile, and it's a problem.
Yeah, and we even seen with Veroka when she realizes kind of what's happened, right? And we'll talk about the mystery around what happened to Rubens, but and when she sort of realizes it, and she comes home. So even after, despite the repression, because she needs to be back with her family. So let's talk a little bit more about forced disappearances. There's a line in the movie from Eunice saying forced disappearances were one of the cruelest acts of the regime because you kill one person and condemn all the others to eternal psychological torture. So why are they so devastating, and what makes their status of forced disappearances a crime under international law?
I think they are devastating because they don't end with the initial act. The doubt, the absence of a body, and the denial of truth makes the pain last longer. Families are trapped in a cycle of not knowing, unable to mourn or move forward. It's not just one life taken, it's an entire family condemned to live with permanent psychological torture. And forced disappearances are considered among the worst human rights violations. In 2006, the United Nations adopted a convention specifically on this issue, defining them as crimes against humanity when carried out systematically. What makes them especially cruel is that they are a continuing crime. The violence doesn't end with the arrest or death. Families live without answers, without the body, without the right to mourn. It is exactly the devastating and enduring nature of this form of violence that makes forced disappearances such a central concern of international law, which classifies them as crimes against humanity when systematic, prohibits their amnesty, and imposes on states a duty to investigate, prosecute, and provide reparations to victims and their families.
I think the film really shows you this impact and it takes you through. And we can see in the beginning, right, where they really don't know, right, what's happened. Where, you know, initially after Rubens is taken and even after he's been gone and Eunice comes in, they really don't know. He might just be in a prison somewhere. And one of the first battles Eunice has to wage is to get to even acknowledge that the government had arrested Rubens, right? I mean, that's what. So this secret arrest, and so with the help of a lawyer friend or a friend, she files a habeas corpus petition. What are some of the obstacles Eunice faces, and what role does the habeas petition play in this context?
Habeas corpus exists exactly to protect against arbitrary detention. It requires that anyone arrested be brought before a judge. But after AI5, habeas corpus was suspended in political cases. So whenever Eunice filed petitions to locate Rubens, the courts either claimed lack of jurisdiction or simply refused to hear them. It was like knocking on a door you knew was locked. Even so, these petitions mattered symbolically. They kept the fight alive, showed that there was resistance in the legal sphere, and exposed the regime's manipulation of the law. They also mattered because acknowledgement itself was crucial, forcing the state to admit Rubens had been detained was the first step toward breaking the wall of denial.
One other tool that Eunice and her friends and supporters use is to try to get international attention on Rubens's disappearance. And his case does get a great deal of attention, right? Their daughter, Baroka, right, who's in London, that's how she knows all about it. She says it's all over the news, right? And so I guess as a strategy, how did advocates and victims seek to leverage international pressure? And did that have any kind of effect on the military government?
I think international pressure was a key weapon for families. Families, lawyers, and human rights groups took cases like Rubens to the United Nations and the Organization of American States, but they also relied heavily on the foreign press. The kidnapping of ambassadors, for example, forced the regime to free political prisoners who then gained visibility abroad. People like Fernando Gabeira and José Dirceu became well known internationally. Exiled artists like Caetano and Gil also used their platforms in Europe to denounce repression. This network of external accusations undercuts the dictatorship's image of modernity and progress. And it had a real impact. It embarrassed Brazilian authorities, generated critical reports from international bodies, and gave moral support to those resisting inside the country.
One of the key moments, I mean, perhaps the key moment in the film, comes when Eunice learns from Rubens' inner circle that he had been killed, right? So they know. So she finds out. It's a while, but relatively early on in terms of the longer story that he's been killed. They don't have any details. They don't know how or where he died. The military still won't admit they had him in custody. And so at that point, that's sort of a turning point for Eunice, right? And she has to rebuild her life and her family's life without Rubens. So how does she respond to these personal and material, including financial challenges? And and are there sort of broader messages about how families had to cope when faced with the disappearance of a loved one?
I think, I guess Eunice faced the brutal absence of Rubens while raising her children alone. Instead of retreating into private grief, she reinvented herself. She went back to school, earned her law degree at age 47, and became a respected human rights lawyer working with families of disappeared and also in defense of indigenous peoples. Her journey shows how she turned personal tragedy into political and social strength. For her, surviving meant rebuilding everyday life while insisting on the fight for memory and justice, not just for Rubens, I guess, but for all who suffered under the dictatorship.
Yeah, I think that's really well put. And I should say, Eunice was, I'd say, upper middle class or fairly affluent, educated. And although, she had five children and then it was a struggle, she, in some sense, had certain advantages that other people might not have. But even so, despite the fact that she had resources, everything was challenging. There's that one scene where she goes to the bank and she tries to take out money that she needs. And because of, I think it's a joint account, so there was a requirement of her husband's signature, or maybe that was a law under Brazil dealing with the nature of family financial relations. Whatever it is, she can't get the money, even though the bank agent who, knows her well, knows that Rubens has been disappeared.
Yeah, Eunice truly stands as an example of struggle and perseverance in the face of very difficult circumstances. And this example of bank is a good example of the situation of every family who had a person who disappeared in dictatorship.
There's another scene which I just want to ask you a little bit more about. One of the early scenes we see before anything has happened to Rubens and Eunice and their family, but it is that the military dictatorship seems more like a shadow, right? You see them going out probably a weekend day with the family. They're having ice cream in an ice cream parlor. Life is proceeding very normally, right? I found it, in the most powerful sort of moments in the movie was when they go back after Rubens has disappeared. And I think at this point, Eunice knows he's been killed. She hasn't really told her family, but they're back. And the scene feels very different. She knows she can no longer pretend that there's any kind of normalcy. And yet, life does go on, it's seemingly pretty normally for probably everybody else in the ice cream shop, or they've adjusted, they've made their peace to some extent, or they're living under the dictatorship. So how much, if not active support, passive support for, did the military dictatorship have during this time? Because it seems like, a lot of people did kind of go on, and for them, life proceeded fairly normally much of the time.
I think at the start, the regime had considerable support, especially from the urban middle class, business sectors, and parts of the media. Many believed the military had saved the country from communism and brought stability to the country. Support was also fueled by the economic miracle, fast growth in the late 60s and early 70s, but it wasn't just passive acceptance. Some sectors called for this repression. Conservative groups defended censorship, denounced neighbors or teachers as subversives, and even organized violent actions like the Communist Hunters, which stormed a theater performance of Roda Viva by Chico Buarque. And in this episode, they violently attacked the cast on stage and vandalized the theater. And one of the actresses, Marília Pera, later recalled that the violence was met with indifference and even approval from parts of the audience. Instead of helping, some people said the attack was well-deserved, as a lesson for those who dared to challenge morality and good customs. So the dictatorship was sustained not only by military force, but also by collaboration from parts of society. And this continuity matters. Decades later, some of these same conservative sectors re-emerged in their support for Bolsonaro, echoing old patterns of backing authoritarian leaders who promise order.
That's such helpful background. And the movie kind of doesn't really get into all that, but I feel like it sort of sums it up. There's one line where Eunice is being interrogated by the military interrogator when she's at the barracks. And one of the things he tells her about why she's in custody is he tells her, you know, we're trying to preserve and protect your way of life so you can continue your life seeing your friends, playing backgammon. And that sort of encapsulates to some extent what you're saying. So the film, after the first part, the longest part, is the disappearance of Rubens, the realization that Eunice learning from friends that he's been killed, and then having to rebuild. And so the sort of first part ends with the family packing up the car and moving to Sao Paulo, saying goodbye to Rio. We then jump forward in time to 1996. So we're now 25 years later. By then, as you mentioned, Eunice is a successful human rights lawyer, and she finally obtains a death certificate from the state. At this point, the military dictatorship has ended, and this is the first acknowledgement that her husband had been killed. So what happens in this period? Kind of go from 1970, 1996. Why and how does the military dictatorship end? And then also, why is this death certificate so important? Even though Eunice has known Rubens had been killed for 25 years.
I think in this period, Brazil went through huge political changes after the height of repression, the peak of the repression. The regime began a slow political opening in the 70s. In 1979, the amnesty law allowed exiles and political prisoners to return to Brazil, but also shielded military officials accused of torture and murder and disappearances. In 1985, after more than 2 decades without free presidential elections, Tancredo Neves was indirectly chosen as president, and after his death, José Sarney assumed office, marking the official end of the dictatorship. And in 1988, Brazil adopted a new democratic constitution. But for Eunice, this timeline meant something different. Through all these political shifts, she was still fighting the state silence. Only in 1996, more than 25 years later, did she finally obtain an official death certificate for Rubens, proof he had been killed in military custody. The gap between Brazil's celebrated political transition and the reality of families like hers is stark. Democracy returned, but the truth came only in fragments much later. And I think the certificate is so significant because it was the first official acknowledgement by the Brazilian state that Rubens had been killed in custody. Eunice had known for decades, but without an official record. The family lived in a kind of limbo, with no documentation, with no right to properly mourn. Like I said, the certificate didn't bring Rubens back, but it ended the institutional lie that weighed on the family daily. For Eunice, it was a relief. Finally, the state admitted what it had denied for 25 years. Collectively, it also symbolized hope. It showed other families of the disappeared that persistence could eventually force the truth out of silence.
Yeah, and the film captures it sort of it's I don't want to say celebration, but it's bittersweet. But there's a sense of relief, right? When they have it, the family goes. There's a news event around it. There's even like she has a scrapbook. Eunice has a scrapbook and puts the certificate in, and then there's like a sense of closing of the book. They can finally only now close this particular, have some closure on the period on what happened. The film though doesn't end there, right? So we've got this jump forward to 2014 again, so almost 20 years later. At this point, Eunice is elderly, wheelchair bound. She's suffering from Alzheimer's disease. The family, they're all together. It's a larger extended family. Eunice is watching television, sort of from inside. Everyone is outside having lunch. And she sees this report of the Truth Commission describing the atrocities committed by the military dictatorship. And the report mentions Rubens's case. He's described as an icon or one of the icons of the resistance. And despite her mental state, Eunice appears to recognize him and to remember the past starts to come back, it appears. So what's happened now, right, in this next sort of period of time from 1996 to 2014? And what was the Truth and Reconciliation Committee in Brazil?
In 2014, Brazil completed the work of the National Truth Commission established in 2012 to investigate the dictatorship's crimes. It was historic because the state officially recognized that torture, executions, and disappearances had been state policy, not isolated excesses. The commission documented 434 killed and disappeared, including Rubens Paiva, whose case was highlighted as emblematic. The commission had no power to punish, but it played a crucial role in giving visibility, gathering evidence, and restoring dignity to victims and families. For Eunice, then elderly and ill, seeing Rubens' name acknowledged nationally was the confirmation of a lifelong struggle. For Brazil, it was a call to memory, a reminder that democracy is rooted in suffering and at the same time resistance.
And so it seems we have with the individual acknowledgement of Rubens through the death certificate in 1996, and then through the findings society-wide, if you will, of the Truth Commission about what happened, the disappearances of Rubens and others, torture. But we do have seem to be kind of a divergence, which you've touched on, between the sort of truth and the acknowledgement, right, the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, and then what we often think of as other forms of accountability, that is holding individuals responsible, typically through criminal prosecution for what were crimes of murder, extrajudicial detention, torture. And so the film tells us at the end, for example, that while the Brazilian government admitted Rubens had been murdered in the army barracks in July 1971, that 5 officials had been charged. None had been arrested or punished. And this is, I think, emblematic, if I'm not wrong, of kind of what happened in Brazil, in contrast to, say, Chile and Argentina, where you had not just truth and reconciliation, but you had accountability in terms of criminal prosecutions. So, yeah, I just wonder if you could talk about that split in Brazil's overall approach to accountability.
I think in Brazil, we have a problem of accountability because the 1975 amnesty law was framed as national reconciliation and not as accountability to the crimes and everything. It allowed exiles and political prisoners to return, like I said, but at the same time, it also granted impunity to state agents responsible for torture, murder, and disappearances. In 2010, Brazil's Supreme Court upheld this interpretation. That same year, however, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights ruled that such crimes are crimes against humanity and cannot be amnestied. So we live with a contradiction. Internationally, Brazil must investigate and punish. Domestically, the amnesty still blocks prosecutions. This institutional silence is part of why Bolsonaro could, decades later, openly celebrate the coup and honor torturers like Colonel Ustra, the legal shield, means the past was never fully confronted, leaving space for authoritarian nostalgia to flourish. And this is the same silence that helps explain why Bolsonaro himself could more recently attempt a new coup. His trial for trying to subvert democracy shows that the past is never really past. When impunity prevails, authoritarianism finds new ways to return.
It does, and I mean, I think there's even a connection. I think too is U.S. President Trump, who's been applying tremendous pressure on Brazil before Bolsonaro was convicted, not to prosecute him and not to do that. And but in a sense, to me, that's exactly emblematic of what you're saying, where we've had no real accountability for Trump's attempt to overturn support through violent means, the outcome of the 2020 presidential election. So it's no accountability in the U.S. trying to undermine accountability in Brazil. It's interesting because my understanding is the fact that he was convicted and sentenced in that sense, it's a break or a different path than the way that what happened in the military dictatorship. But again, in Bolsonaro's, I understand that there's also calls now for amnesty as well, and that's sort of something that's on the table.
I think the military regime has a centralized in the armed forces, especially the presidency, which ruled by decree through institutional acts. And now we have a democratic constitution. So the current authoritarianism and the current democratic erosion is part of how institutions remain formally intact under the 1988 constitutions, but have space for this type of movement of authoritarian practice. And I think now we have authoritarian practices that emerge not from a complete rupture, from a coup, but through erosion from within, such as pressures on the judiciary, manipulation of information, fake news, and the legitimization of electoral process. And there is a difference, but I think the nature is the same.
I wonder how the film was received in Brazil in terms of what it's grappling with in terms of Brazil's past and how it speaks to some extent, the present moment.
So critics and human rights advocates received it very warmly because it centers on emblematic case and foregrounds in Eunice's path. At the same time, parts of the right mobilized boycotts and claimed the film is rewriting the past. That polarized reception, it shows how the memory of the dictatorship is still contested. For some, the film is historical justice. For others, it's reopening wounds they'd rather keep closed. I think we have a polarized reception in Brazil.
And opening up the things for discussion about what actually happened in the past kind of being recontested maybe. Given events around the world, well, in Brazil, in the United States, I mean, it seems a very timely film. If you could summarize, what's the message that the film offers in terms of where we are collectively today?
It's a difficult question. Where we are right now, we have at the same time a constitution in Brazil that is a democratic constitution, that we have constitutional rights, we have institutions that preserve democracy. But at the same time, this idea of authoritarianism is in a moment of power with Bolsonaro and with the right in the Congress, not in executive right now because we have the President Lula, but in the institutions and in the parliament, we have a lot of power to write. And I think it's a repercussion of this type of movement of authoritarianism. And that's it, I think.
I can say for me as a viewer, having seen this film recently, it would have registered very differently for me 10 years ago, certainly before 2016 and maybe even since, and certainly before more recent events. It certainly would have been powerful and would have been a powerful understanding of what happened in Brazil. But, as someone, viewing this, in the United States in 2025, it really speaks in a way about the patterns of authoritarianism and the way it kind of can seep in to daily life, and things that seemed very distant or very foreign or not happening here are quite relevant. So, I mean, for the U.S., it seems Australia could have a subtitle, or it could happen here.
I think in reality, the current democratic setbacks in Brazil and the United States are deeply connected to an authoritarian logic that corrodes institutions from within rather than dismantling them outright. In both contexts, here and in United States, authoritarian practices operate through the erosion of trust in electoral systems, the delegitimization of independent institutions, and the mobilization of disinformation and polarization. Instead of overtly suspending constitutions, as in classic authoritarian regimes, these movements hollow out democratic norms while keeping formal structures in place. This logic is authoritarian because it seeks to weaken pluralism, silence dissent, and concentrate power, whether by pressuring courts, attacking the press, or fostering hostility against minorities. Both Brazil and the US illustrate how contemporary authoritarianism relies less on military force and more on populist mobilization, cultural wars, and digital networks to destabilize democracy from the inside. In this sense, the events in both countries are not isolated, but part of transnational pattern of democratic erosion that reflects the persistence and adaptation of authoritarian practices in the 21st century, I think.
Yeah, that's so well put, and I think it just shows why the film, is important to understanding what happened in Brazil, but also speaks more broadly to issues around the world.
I think this question of authoritarianism and the persistence of authoritarianism is important, but what strikes me most about I'm Here is not just the portrait of a dark era, but how state violence did not simply vanish with the regime. In 1971, Rubens Paiva was taken from his home by the military and never returned. And decades later, in 2018, Pedro Henrique was killed in Brazil inside his home, allegedly by the police. Different times, different contexts, yet both lives cut short by state force. And in Rio, we have a lot of violence. And the film reminds us that, like Eunice and like so many mothers and wives today, countless women in Brazil carry the burden of memory, justice, and dignity. The Constitution changed, rights are on paper and on reality, but their promise still hasn't reached everyone equally. And this is why the film resonates so strongly today and to me in a country where authoritarian nostalgia reemerged under Bolsonaro and where state violence still excessively targets youth. Black men in poor communities. I'm Still Here is not only about 70s, it's about the present. It's a warm that democracy is fragile and the memory is essential to defend it. As long as there are people who fight, who remember, and who refuse to normalize violence, I think we are still here, you know.
Well, Isabela, I want to thank you so much for coming on the podcast and talking about I'm Still Here. And for those listening, if you haven't seen this movie, you should see it as soon as you're able.
So thank you, Jonathan. It was a great pleasure for me. I would like to express my sincere gratitude for the opportunity to share these reflections and to engage in such inspiring dialogue about this film. Thank you very much for the attention and for the generosity of this exchange.